Coming at you from the Exodus headquarters in Ohio, let's jump right into today's episode.
Alrighty, everyone, we are live and we are bringing another episode with Jeff here at his office, and we're going to be covering a topic that hopefully a lot of people will find value in. It is basically running trail cameras in the big woods, and I think that the big woods is very intimidating for a lot of people, and just trying to chop up any piece of ground that is kind of continuous in a lot of ways in comparison to a lot of people hunting small parcels. It could be a big task to tackle, and obviously cameras can help help to some degree. So we're going to be talking about how to run trail cameras on big woods type.
That sounds like a good
properties.
topic.
So we just had some lunch out. My lunch was really good. How about you guys?
Yeah, it's really good. Stockyard Bar and Grill in Coon Valley. Pretty good.
Shout out, yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Homemade chips, homemade fries.
Yeah.
Meatball sub.
Awesome meatball sub.
There was a couple
Soup is great.
couple additional mounts that were at that establishment.
Yeah.
One that so.
Yeah, I've had quite a few mounts there for a while, and start taking them out and putting them down here. So I feel bad, but I like having the spot here at home. So
yeah, it's really neat. So, I guess let's dive right into the topic. And what I don't know what to ask first, because there's a lot to talk about. But
yeah, I think it's so different on big public land tracts. Small private land. You're looking at areas, I love mock scrapes, water holes, but you're looking at really tight areas. And so on a 40-acre parcel with 5 to 6 cameras, you can cover just about everything. You should give you, if you have a good pattern of movement on that 40 acres and you design the habitat well, that should tell you what every buck that's within 3/4 mile to a mile of that in every direction, where they're at, especially in fragmented ag land. Difference in big woods is you need to move those cameras a 1/4 mile, 3/4 mile apart to tell you what's going on in a big area. You can't just take it for faith that they're going to come through this really small area. And so a lot of times, to me, on public land, you can really get kind of pigeonholed into where you have to, you're putting them into a corner, you're putting them on a bedding area, you're putting onto a certain scrape that doesn't facilitate large movement. So it's a tight corner. There's a drop off along the side, whatever it might be. And I think that's one of the first steps. You need to start thinking large. And when I'm spacing my trail cameras out, and there's a method to where they're going in the first place, but just real quick, when I'm spacing them out, they're 1/4 mile apart, 600 yards apart, 800 yards, if I'm in a certain area, as opposed to 150 yards. Mm-hmm. And
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, and that's it's like you have to cast a wider net. Maybe same number of cameras.
Yes.
But a much bigger net.
Yes. So when you're looking at large tracts of public land, big woods, when you're breaking that down and looking for structure or something that would gain interest, and you're crossing off areas, how big of a chunk are you breaking? Like if you have 100,000 acres, how big of a chunk are you downsizing and kind of focusing on? Is it 1,000 acres? Is it 500?
No, I would say it's more like 1,000 to 1,500 acres, and then maybe 2,000 acres. But you're going into very specific points within that 2,000 acres or 1,000 acres, whatever it is, and you're looking for old rub sign, old scrape sign, maybe sign from the year before. The more years, the better. If it's a new clear-cut area, then it's going to introduce, therefore, new buck sign because it's attracting more buck to that area. Then I'm looking for sign that might coincide with when that clear cut was actually cut. But I'm looking for big movement areas, big movements between clear cuts, big movement along the side of a clear cut, big road crossings, areas of timber, long ridges, long points that extend off a ridge to where you have the main parent ridge and then a long side ridge that might be 1/4 mile to 1/2 mile long. And then I'm looking for a saddle in that area. And I'm trying to complement that with old sign. So you're looking at points of interest and points of sign that you're already going to hunt around. And then I'm placing those cameras exactly where I hunt. And I'm doing the same on private land. I'm putting a camera typically within bow shot where you can shoot the camera with your bow. But it's the same on public land. You're choosing spots spread out over for reasons why I have habitat change and long lines of movement, transition movement, cruising movement, and that's where I'm placing those cameras.
So are those camera locations purely on topographical features to movement, or are there food source locations also?
If they're near food source movements, it's on movement to that food source, not movement necessarily within that food. I want to know where those bucks are coming to that food source. The fact that they're in the area is all I want to check.
Inventory purposes.
I really don't care if they're on the food or if they're on a cruising area, if they're on a scrape. I just want to know if they're in the area. So I want to find well-used travel routes, scrape locations in the early season, even when you have early acorns falling. I'm trying to think of the acorn out there that's, white oak, obviously, and white oak, and not bur oak.
Sawtooth?
Yeah, sawtooth oaks. What's the really big acorn that's down in
English?
Yeah, it's a very big one. I'm trying to think of the name of that one, but there's a giant oak or acorn down in southern Ohio, and those are falling early. You'll find a lot of early scrapes over that area. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not the white oak; it's a larger one. But and so I'm looking for areas like that where, and even there, I'm putting a camera in a saddle. So I want to see big movement. I want to see where the deer are coming from, and so where they're coming from, the fact that they're there in the area, and spreading out that camera formation basically just to make sure that there are bucks in that area and hitting those really good movement areas. So not necessarily in the food source, because then that's not telling me where they're coming from.
Right. So everything's back to that bed to kind of food movement extending.
Or bed to bed.
But
you're not going to find much travel activity from bed to bed in the early season when they're not cruising.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
I was Googling acorns over here. Is it the Massey cup?
Nope.
I've never heard of that.
Nope.
Apparently they get pretty big.
It's a chestnut oak. Chestnut acorn.
Yep.
Perfect.
That's about what they look like.
Go up to the leaf one time. See, I feel like people. Is that also the same thing as a sawtooth? Is that the same thing as a sawtooth?
It's not a sawtooth.
I'm really bad about subspecies of oaks, but when you have like that I don't know, pear-shaped or oval-shaped leaf with like the saw teeth around the edge, like that kind of reminded me of. Who knows? I think half the stuff I read sometimes doesn't make sense in my own brain.
I'll text Dylan. He knows everything.
He's educated in this space, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Yep. Yeah, and that's an acorn that we don't see around here. It's a 3/4 inch long, maybe a 1/4 inch in diameter, a little bit more, but a lot of meat to it. It falls early.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's probably one of the things. I take myself kind of out of this equation for the most part, because we have access to so many cameras. We have cameras kind of scattered everywhere, whether there's food sources or pinch points during travel to and from bed or to and from food, in clear cuts in food. But we're taking the same approach where we're casting a really wide net, probably 10 times what a normal person would cast, and then when we have pictures of deer on 2 of those that are correlated to each other, then we move more cameras in and try to pinpoint, figure out.
Got to add a dozen cameras.
Yeah, got to add
at least
40's not enough. Got to get to 50, 60, 70.
Yeah, I know we kind of got sidetracked on the oak, but really, first off, we're looking for a certain area that has a lot of diversity of habitat change, a lot of topography change, and then we're going in there. And in the case of some of the areas I like to hunt, I really like to hunt clear cuts. If I'm in the UP in Michigan, then it's more just pure diversity, especially down in the swamp. So you're not hunting the big open hardwoods where there's no food, there's no acorns up there. You're not hunting the big conifer spruce swamps because there's no food. Mm-hmm. You're not hunting the big tag alder swamps because there's no food. You're looking for that transition area in between where you might have some aspen regeneration, some red osier dogwood, some soft maple. So you have some good browse, briars where you need sunlight but you need dry ground. So you're looking for those areas, kind of a transition between those major habitat groups that don't hold a lot of deer because it's open hardwoods or swampland, marshland, grassland, tag alder land that just there's no food. And so you're looking for those browse areas. And that's the same in some of the big hardwood public land settings where you're looking for change. You're looking at change of elevation, clear-cut lines. It might be road crossings. And then, so I'm putting out I'm looking at that area, first identifying this is the 2,000 acres or 1,000 acres that I want to hunt. And then I'm purely spending a couple days, maybe in just a day, to go in and identify 7, 8, 9 areas that I've circled on a map by topography and aerial photo. Like we were saying earlier, the Onyx hunt is great because you have that topography line overlay over the aerial photo. But you're going into those specific locations, 6 or 7 areas, and you're saying, okay, there's old buck sign here. There's old perennial scrape sign. And so it looks like current movement. So I'm putting a camera there, and then we're just leaving. We're letting them soak for a couple months. And that could be that we have some high, could be that we have some low, but we're really not using 8 to 10 cameras. We're using 4, 5, 6. Then those cameras, a lot of times, are spread out by a quarter to half mile and a lot of elevation change. So,
are you finding those movements change with food sources?
They sure do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we were talking about that acorn that's dropping up on top and some of those flats and some of those sun-exposed areas and those good mature old oaks. Then when those are dropping for those weeks in late September, early October, then that's where those first scrapes starts popping up. There's a lot of use, but then the bucks move out of that area when those acorns are done, and it's those southwest facing slopes or southeast where you have the white oak acorns, they're leaving there. But then certainly those clear cuts, and it's almost like those clear cuts, anywhere, it doesn't matter if they're in the UP in Michigan or Illinois, Indiana, there's a certain age that those clear cuts are really working, and it's those really young years. And it gets to a certain point now in the UP in Michigan with aspen clear cutting, they're still using it when they're 8, 9 years old because they can move through it. But in some of those clear cuts more southerly, they're filling in at year 5, 6, so you can't walk through it, they can't walk through it.
Yeah.
Nearly impossible to navigate through it if you're a deer-sized critter or larger.
Mm-hmm.
So can be such feast or famine.
So are those camera locations with 4 or 5 cameras inside of that 1,000 or 2,000 acres, are you moving those
Typically not, because we're trying to focus on specific stand locations that relate to lay of the land and bench systems, travel corridors, bench system travel corridors that relate to saddles, movement around points, movement from point to point across a hollow that's not too steep. And so we're focusing on large movement. And so when the mature bucks are moving in all those areas, typically there's a food source somewhat nearby.
Right.
There's good elevation change. And so it's probable that the deer will be there at the end of September, early October. But they're going to be there during the rut. And by having 5 cameras out, 4 cameras out, it can tell you a lot over a large landscape because it's all similar landscape. Mm-hmm. And so obviously you're not going to if you put a camera by a food source, right on a food source, if it's changing, depending on if people are blowing that, that's the problem on public land. A lot of those big food sources, people are keying on, so you're going to see more people sometimes than deer. So I like going adjacent, again, to those food sources. For one, you're looking at movement around the food source or to the food source, and then 2, you're keeping them away from people and other hunters. And so
that's a good point.
You're just trying to really get a sampling of the area in the mature bucks. And so if you're putting them on those old rub lines and old scrape lines, then if there's a mature buck in the area, he's still going to follow those same lines. You can get pictures of them.
What do you find most efficient for daytime data with trail cameras? Is it topography features in a movement, or is it scrape activity? Probably not large food sources unless there's relation to adjacent cover. But where do you see the most daytime stuff going on?
Interior areas. So there's a lot of areas where I can think of one oak flat that we had, and we had a lot of scrapes there. There are a few rubs scattered around, and we had a lot of good buck pictures, but the majority of them were at night. Now, they were on a pretty good access trail. It was a half-hour walk in, but still there was a lot of boot traffic. But then just 400 yards away and 200 elevation feet below, we're getting pictures of 8 to 10 bucks over that same period, and they're more daylight. And so we do find that more of those interior movements away from food and, of course, away from people are giving us a lot more daylight pictures. Now, it might be that it's a ridge that takes a long time to walk to. It's a finger ridge. It's a long it features a really nice long drop off down below that goes up to another big ridge system, and so it's easy access for deer to funnel along that point from the bottom up and past that trail camera, and then that might go to a big clear cut eventually 3/4 mile away. But you're in big movement areas, so that if deer do move through there, they're going to move on this ridge, because everywhere else is a steep climb for them to come up. And not that they won't go through there, but what I find a lot of times is that you're just, again, you're playing poker to where, yeah, they might have a 5-10% chance they move up that steep grade, but that long sweeping point right in the middle of it, and with old sign and with old rubs, old scrape sign, is a lot more definitive location. And you could take, that could be one camera per 500 acres or 300 acres, and you're narrowing down all that lay of land to a central location that facilitates good deer movement away from people movement.
That brings a good point up as far as interior movement not being impeded, I guess, by human traffic. Have you, for you specifically, hunting public land so far away and trying to hit those locations on good weather days, those high value weather days, or have you in the past used cameras on access trails or parking areas or anything of just in a manner to watch what the foot traffic actually is, or what the hunting pressure may be potentially in that area? So when you get down there, maybe you're not, there wasn't a guy in there 2 days before and has the place blown up.
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the time we can tell a lot of traffic just by where we're parking, of course. But when we're going back down to the areas we hunt, as long as I'm not seeing people on the trail cameras, but we've had trail cameras where someone's walked by and they have a shotgun, and so they're just bird hunting. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot different than someone walking by with a big stand location and bow stand set up. Most of the time we're not putting cameras just to watch individual movement, because we're just going down there with 5 or 6 cameras and putting them out. So we're not spending a trail camera on that location unless we see we think a mature buck's going to go by that location. Understood. Now, at the same time, a lot of those points in a lot of those areas we're accessing, you can tell if someone's walked down just by, if up north, you can tell by crushed ferns. A lot of people are leaving ribbon in the woods, tacks. Oh, yeah. Crushed brush, like maybe off the trail, you have to go through some briars to get to the main finger line ridge that you're walking down to a stand location. So you can tell if people have been through the area. And then we're putting that camera in a location that typically it's not on the side of a steep grade. And of course it's not in a big greenbrier patch. It's in an area where it's a bench or a saddle, and it's a good deer movement area, which also means that people are focusing on that. So pretty easy to see if we get back there. And so there's been times we've walked into an area and we use a 2-inch viewing screen religiously. And to me, it's a big luxury, because up to 3 or 4 years ago when I started using the Exodus, I did not have that. I had some of my Moultrie cameras 5-6 years ago. But that transition into all 2-inch viewing screens, I'll walk in there and I'll look at the camera before I hunt. And if I'm not seeing any bucks, if I'm seeing people, then of course I might get out of there. But especially I'm using that to see if there's any mature bucks. And you can have an occasional person walk by with the thought that this is the best location for a deer to move, and that's often the best place for us to move. And so then you're down there and you see a person that moved by 4 days ago, but at the same time you're seeing mature buck activity, and he only went through 4 days ago. He probably came out somewhere else. Maybe he went in and out. It's just that one time, but you're still seeing that buck activity. That buck activity is going to be my determination if I'm going to hunt there or not. For example, you go in there and there's a lot of, a little bit of people movement, but you're still seeing good bucks. I'd rather hunt that stand then than if I'm going into an area, of course, and not seeing any mature bucks on that 2-inch viewing screen. Right. So I do make a lot of, in the field decisions based on those 2-inch. And that's where those trail cameras spread out, and having trail cameras near your stand locations to me is more beneficial than watching people maybe up by the truck. Mm-hmm. Just because it gives you so much intel of whether you should sit there or not. And I have made, and so typically if let's say that I have a camera in this location, and then I have another one in a saddle on a stand of acorns that's 700 yards away, I'm going down into that camera and I'm seeing people movement, no deer, whatever it might be. And then I'm not going to flip back over to that one that's 700 yards away. I'd probably go back to the truck, go a half mile down the road and go into that other stand location on another ridge, just with a thought that there's no bucks on this picture or on this trail camera. I'm not going to wait for them to show up, and they might never show up. And at least I'll go try a new spot, and then I'll check that trail camera. If that's not working, and so I want enough space in between my stand locations and cameras that they're really looking at different movements, so that when I go out there, they're reflective of each other, meaning there's not much movement that could take place in between the cameras. You know, they're not a mile apart, but they're that good half mile to 3/4 mile. Sometimes it's a crow fly, sometimes all the way up and down the other side, to where they're almost represent overlapping movements, but areas that I can get into if I think one place is sour.
Do you ever, with your camera spread out that far, are you ever worried about not, missing photos of a specific deer, or not knowing a deer's in the area? Or is that just, an odds game?
And that could happen, especially in the earlier season when they're more locked into a early season movement. But when it gets into the rut, I want to have my cameras close enough to where I feel that there's really not much that's going to, for example, out in some of the real hill country areas, which I love hunting just because they can eliminate portions of acres that you don't need to hunt. Mm-hmm. So if you have a very large ravine system in between one camera and the other, and it might be that it's downhill 400 or 500 yards, 600 yards, and you're dropping 300 to 400 feet in elevation, and then it's all the way up the other side. So really surface ground area, it's a half mile away. Maybe in 3/4 mile. But I feel in between, there's not much deer usage, and if it is, and it's that long-range cruising movement, even in early November, then that movement's going to be reflected up on those upper benches where I might have those trail cameras. And it might be maybe access in the bottom, and then you have a trail camera down low, and you have one up high. Whatever it is, you have enough ground in between for separation and to get into overlapping deer herds, but not so close that you're really putting those in the same location, and not so far apart that you can leave a gap like that where you look at that area and say, you know what, because there's other food sources, because of the lay of the land, I feel that this is another buck area completely in between. Mm-hmm. And so you're really trying to, and I would say in those big areas, to get into separate buck movements, you're probably looking at least a half mile of ground, maybe 3/4 mile. Would you think that's? Yeah, and even then it might be overlapping. You want to be where it's barely overlapping, but represents a potential of different bucks.
Yeah, I can think of a couple camera locations where, specifically during the rut, those early days of November in southern Ohio, maybe the 3rd to the 5th, 6th. Where we'll get some bucks in the morning time where they're just starting to overlap. Like we'll have a camera on a ridge top or a bench or saddle system. We'll get a few different deer, but we're getting them more consistently on a different movement. If that makes sense. Yeah. So we do see that a little bit.
And it's obviously you're not going to spread your cameras out every 200 yards. Right. There's a certain distance, and a mile apart you're missing some stuff in between. Yeah. But there's that happy spot, and they're really big movements on public land. So, to me, your cameras need to be spread out like that. I can think of when we've gone down, we've had about 5 in an area, and that covers a huge area, a couple thousand acres. But again, within those couple thousand acres, we're only focusing on 8, 10, 12 potential stand locations, and then we're narrowing it down based on sign to 4, 5, and 6 maybe, and then going from there.
What about scrape locations? Scrape locations in regards to benches, saddles, and then bedding or doe bedding specifically, I guess. Are you hanging cameras there at all?
I love scrape locations on public land, and in some areas it's really interesting because if you're up in the marshes and really brush country of the more wilderness settings, up northern settings, for example, you just don't find a lot of scrapes. And if they are, they're out in the swamps and they're on a little island edge or something. But the rub lines out there are so important. So you have some big traditional rub lines and rubs that are carved out, trees that are carved out, jack pine or tamarack that have been carved out for a long time, been used for a long time. And I really focus on those. And there might only be one rub every 200 yards. And, on average, and then I'm really focusing on those locations more for a camera. Or when you get into the hill country, it seems like those flats and those benches, those little finger ridges where you expect little elbows of ridge line, where you expect deer movement, those big scrapes and perennial scrapes are more of a focus for me. And it might be that there's rubs around the corner, but they're more in areas that I want that more open visual. The reason that scrape there isn't there in the first place to me is because it's a very good movement, safe, social area. I find a lot more rubs tucked back in those wilderness or those hill country areas in corners. Nighttime movements in the bottoms and hemlocks, but little points where it's a really tight area to hunt and doesn't necessarily reflect a big major buck movement. Where those scrapes, they seem to hit those scrapes a lot more often.
Yeah, that's.
And it's different in a swamp and a wilderness area because they usually have only a certain percentage of dry ground that they can walk across from one location to the other.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And they're leaving those rubs.
And that's scrapes. In the big woods, southern Ohio, that's one of the if we see a scrape, we're hanging a camera there almost automatically, especially if it's in relation to heavy security cover, because it seems like a lot of times those deer will use scrapes during the day versus like you get an ag ground, field edges, different scenarios like that, where a lot of times those deer are coming in at night because there is no security.
Yeah, and it's kind of on the private land. Our mock scrapes that are back in the timber ways and on the way to food, huge daylight movement. But then when you're looking at those edge scrapes on an ag field, I know personally because they're hitting our food plots and then they're going to the ag, and those scrapes out in that ag land are going to be very lightly used during the daylight, if at all.
Yeah, because
the bucks are coming from so long away. But these deep interior scrapes in the hill country and those big public land settings are awesome for putting a trail camera on.
I feel a little lost. I haven't spent much time in the big woods at all, so I can't add anything because I don't know. I don't know. So I think I learned a lot, and I'm glad we covered this. It seems like there's probably more to unpack, but I'm not.
To me, it's with the trail cameras again. It goes back to that big net, and if you really define your trail cam locations to a very tight spot, then you're limiting yourself. And so, for example, a little 3 or 4 acre patch of acorns, for example. Well, if the acorns are down and they're not coming to it, so you limit yourself. So I'd rather put it on interior movements, benches, saddles, movements away from people that could be high or low. And they're areas that I can easily get into, but they're areas that meaning that I can get into, and it's a good spot to hunt, and an area that I could put a trail camera in. Most of those areas are pretty difficult to get cards out if you want to check them quickly. So you almost have to hunt them. And so that sets up a stage where we're putting our trail cameras out. Let's say it was September. And then we're going back middle of October to check the trail cameras and really narrow it down to our specific rut spots. And then we're going back during the rut, and that's when our real serious hunts take place.
Absolutely. I think the one thing to kind of just reiterate, but when people think about 4, 5, 6 trail cameras on 2,000 acres, everyone's like, well, I run 5, 6, 7 trail cameras on 100 acres. But
yeah, in private land.
When you're looking at those big chunks of public land, whether it's hill country, marsh ground, or whatever, you're actually going in and eliminating a lot of that territory, or a lot of that acreage that's not going to be part of that movement. So inside of that, 2,000 acres or 1,000 acres, whatever it is, you're really defining where those bedding areas are, where the movement to food, the food sources, and pinpointing, those camera locations. So
it's kind of like if you look at a giant clear cut. So let's say you have a 40 acre clear cut or an 80 acre clear cut in there. Well, obviously, if you put the camera in the middle of that clear cut and you get some buck pictures, what does that tell you?
Yeah.
It just tells you they're there, which is a good thing. But it doesn't tell you where they came into it. So let's say you put it on the edge, the very edge of the clear cut. Well, unless a buck is going in and out right on that location and that edge of the clear cut or moving along the edge, then you might not even get a picture. So let's say you step it back to a saddle that relates to the movement to that clear cut, or a long bench line around the interior of a giant hollow that relates to that clear cut. Now you can figure out actual movement. You put a trail camera in that location. Are they going to that clear cut? Are they coming from that clear cut? If it's a couple hundred yards away, it gives you a lot more of a, and it's on a good movement. You're not putting it on the steep face. You're not putting on the hog back of a ridge where they're not moving along the top or they're exposed. You're not putting it down in the bottom of a rocky valley where there's a lot of water movement. You're putting on those long side benches that feature a lot of movement with some well-worn deer trails, and that'll tell you a lot about how they're relating to that clear cut. Now, if you're 400 yards on one side, and you're a couple hundred feet in elevation below or above, and then you're doing the same a half mile on the other side, and then you're doing the same in another area that is representative of another clear cut that's 3/4 of a mile in another direction. Now you're starting to see a big movement picture scattered over a large area based on maybe clear cuts, but also based on actually where deer are going to move on those benches and saddles around those clear cuts. And by the time you add it up, your trail cameras in that situation might be literally 3/4 of a mile to a mile apart.
It's good stuff. Yeah.
So if you have never ran cameras on big wood settings, you should have a place to start. So,
Yeah.
And if you have, then hopefully learn some more. I think there's more and more people that are getting drawn to the big woods. Just probably the allure of opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at those numbers and think there's got to be some big deer there, so
Right.
however many acres. So I think being able to break it down and use cameras and learn and use it as a tool is pretty useful.
Oh, sure.
Anything else?
Nope. Just if you are hunting those areas and you're going into some of those big areas that we're talking about, don't expect an easy hunt.
Yeah, it's not easy.
It's
Mentally or physically. I mean, there's two different aspects to it. Mentally, just being disciplined enough to stay patient and not second guess, what you're doing if you feel confident. And then physically, better get your butt in shape.
Yeah, and it's almost it. And you find a high concentration of hunters over the easy access, easy roads in, and it might even be that it's a half-hour walk. But it's just in those areas, you use the hills to set yourself apart from other hunters, and then that should relate again. It all goes back to if it's hard to get to, if it makes sense for a stand location, if you can get away from people, then not only is it a great spot to hang a tree stand in big woods and potentially hunt, but it's also potentially a great spot to hang a trail camera.
Good stuff. Well, thanks once again, and we really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk with us. And I mean, a lot of information covered, and obviously this is going to be distributed at a kind of a longer frame, but we really appreciate it once again. And you can find all your stuff on Amazon, your website, YouTube, and anything else.
Facebook, Instagram.
Yep.
Yeah.
The whole
Yeah, appreciate it.
whole works.
No.
So
Enjoy the conversation.